Oh, hey, hi. Welcome to this technician reference video. Today we're going to talk about voltage drop. So let's take a look at voltage drop in its simplest form and how we can move this over to the car and use it to our advantage. So let's start with a voltage source. Got a battery, and we're going to run out to a light bulb, a switch, return back to ground, and if I close this switch, the light bulb comes on. So let's take a look at voltage drop. If I take a meter and I run one lead each side, the load, 12 volt source, I would expect this being the only load is going to consume my 12 volts, and I'll have 12 volts drop across the bulb. If I open my circuit, the bulb turns off, the meter goes to zero. But now let's reposition our leads and look at this a little bit differently. If I take this lead to ground and I move this lead to this position in front of the load, or in front of the light bulb, what do I get? I've got a 12 volt source, so I'm going to see 12 volts. If I move the lead to the other side of the load, I'm still going to see 12 volts. In an open circuit, I'm going to see source voltage everywhere in that connection. Irrespective of how many ohms my load is, I will still see 12 volts. And in fact, I could have a fuse up here. I could have had transistors, relays, modules, and I would still see my source voltage. Now, how can I use this for diagnostics? So for diagnostics, I first want to test my battery, and I want to know exactly how many volts the battery is. So let's just say this battery is 2.67 volts. And now, when I close my switch, my light comes on, I'm going to place my meter leads across the load. It says 1267 here, but what I'll probably read here will be something on the order of 12.59. It's pretty close. It's not exact. Why? Because everything has resistance. Fuse has resistance, the wires, the connectors, the switch has resistance, my ground connection, the path back to the battery. It all has small amounts of resistance. And how does that affect it? Well, we know if we would have had two light bulbs that were equally sized, they'd be sharing the 12 volts. One would get 6 volts, the other gets 6 volts. Well, if I have one bulb or one load that is considerably larger in resistance than the other load, it's going to get the lion's share of the voltage. Well, this load is considerably larger than the resistance of this wire or this fuse or this switch, which is very negligible. In fact, most of our multimeters can't even detect the small resistance in these wires, right? But we can see it in the form of voltage drop. The missing voltage here, if I were to now take my meter leads and reposition them, and I'm going to say, well, you know what? Let me go from the front of my load back to battery positive. I might see something on the order of 0.03 volts. And if I move them to the other side, so let's say I've got one meter lead after my load, the other one going to battery negative, I might see something on the order of 0.01, 0.02. This is a normal, perfectly functioning circuit. So now let's introduce a bad ground. So we close the switch, we expect the light bulb to come on, but the light bulb does not come on. We know our source voltage is 12.67 because we checked our battery. So now we want to check what's the voltage drop across our load, because we need to have at least 12 something. It's the only load in our circuit. We come up here and we see something on the order of, say, 0.29 volts. Well, that's not right. It's supposed to be something close to 12. So where does the voltage go? Well, let's do the same test we did earlier. We'll take this lead, go back to battery positive, and we see our test result, and we find it's reading 0.01 volts. Well, that should read very low voltage. All right, let's move our leads again to the other side. And we're going to read from the other side of the load back to battery negative. And now we find, say, 12.12. Well, there's my big voltage. That should be lighting my bulb, and in fact, it's not across the bulb, it's dropping across this length, coming back to the battery. So I have a problem. I don't know where the problem is, I close my switch. I'm trying to diagnose why it doesn't function. So I can now start to divide and conquer. I can take any of these leads and start moving them to split the distance. I can bring the lead over here to my ground point, and I still see the same value. Well, that's strange. Let's move this lead, and let's go to the switch. I still have close to the same value. Maybe it changes a little bit. So let's move it to the other side of the switch. I still see the same value. So as I move closer and closer to this point, eventually I'll see that the voltage is dropping across that point. Now, why would it be getting so much voltage? This could be, for example, a 10 kilo ohm resistance. I still have current flowing through the circuit. It's very, very small. We're not going to do the math. It's not enough to light the bulb, and the bulb's not getting the voltage that it really needs to function. So let's take a look at what we just did here on a breadboard. Here we have a circuit. We've got a light bulb. We turn on our source. We've got a switch. We can light the bulb. So taking this meter, and before you use a meter, you should always test it, right? So set it to ohms. Make sure the leads are good. Make sure the meter's good. 0.3. Set it to volts. First thing I want to know is source voltage. The source is 14.09. Now, I expect something very close to that to drop at my load, 13.99. If I read back to battery positive, I've got 0.023. And if I do the same test over to battery negative, I've got 0.06. Now, if I open my circuit, I'm just going to open it by opening my switch. I can come back to my load, and I see 0 voltage drop. I can come back to battery positive, and I see 0 voltage drop. I can come to battery negative. I see 14.11. I see full source voltage. This is my clue that I must have an open circuit. Now let's introduce a bad ground or high resistance. We've got a block of resistors here. Let's take a quick measurement. Here's 10,000 ohms, 10 million ohms, 10,000, and 390 ohms. So let's use the 10,000 ohms because that's the example I put up on the board. So let's suppose that our ground now has high resistance. We can look at our source voltage, and we've got 14.11. We go to our light bulb, which we would expect to have something close to 14 volts. We've got 0.095. So let's do the same test back to battery positive. Got 0.002. So now I know when it was open circuit, I had zeros, all zeros. Now I know there's current flowing through here, and there's a very, very small voltage drop. Let's do the same test to battery negative. I now get 14.01. So the voltage drop, instead of being across the bulb, is now in the ground path. And I can do the same thing I did on the board, I can do here, where I can start to move my leads. I've got 13.9, 13.8. And as I get closer, 13.9, 13.8, at some point I'm going to jump across it, and my voltage drops down to something that I can't even read because it's only the length of this small wire. Right? So if I come to that point, and let's just suppose that this was a connector, we can read across the connector. We've got a voltage drop across the connector, and we can see there's 13.9, 13.8. So let's see how we can use this in a car, because the difficulty here is that we can see this circuit start to finish right here. We can also see it on the board behind me. But on the vehicle, it's a little bit more difficult to see the start and the finish. And we don't know necessarily what's in between. There could be a relay, there could be a module, but everything starts and finishes at the car battery. And that's what we're going to do our voltage drop testing on. All right, so we're going to look at an Outback. We're going to look at a 2022 Outback rear defroster. We'll pull up the wiring diagram, and then we'll go to the car and do our voltage drop testing. So the defroster grid behind me doesn't work. I've looked up the wiring diagram, and if we remove the part that's for the legacy, we can see that there's a fuse, there's a relay, there's a noise suppressor, and then there's our defroster grid. Now, because this noise suppressor is in series, it's going to drop a little bit of the voltage. If you're familiar with noise suppressors, they're usually comprised of a resistor and a capacitor, or two resistors and two capacitors in parallel. So understanding that we're going to lose a little bit there, we want to look at the voltage across the defroster grid. But before we do that voltage drop test, we need to know the actual voltage of the battery. So let's take that reading, then we'll come back here and take our voltage drop test at our grid and see what the result is. Okay, so the first thing I did was I turned on the ignition because I want to see what the battery voltage is. When the ignition is on, I need to know the exact value of the source. The other thing is I've put a battery tender on here because a rear defroster does use a large amount of current and it can drain my battery while I'm working on the vehicle. So if I take a look at my voltage source here, I've got 12.92 volts and our voltage drop is 1.5 volts. So obviously 1.5 volts is not enough to run the defroster grid. We would have expected something closer to source voltage, 10, maybe 12 volts. What we need to do is find where our voltage is dropping. And we're going to do that with another voltage drop test. We're going to go from the positive terminal of the defroster grid all the way to the front to the positive post of the battery. That voltage drop should be something on the order of fractions of a volt. We'll do the same thing for the negative side. Now to do that, these leads just aren't long enough. I can't stretch this from the front of the car to the back of the car. So we have a couple tools available. There is this stretchy coiled type lead set that I can clamp to the battery. This will stretch plus 20 feet, and I can clamp my meter lead to the other end. I also have what's called a retractable lead set, where I can connect this end to the meter, and my test leads on this end, and this will stretch 15 feet. Both of these options will give me the ability to reach the front of the car and test back here. So let's do this and see what our results are. That was 0.3 of a volt, 0.3. This is an acceptable voltage drop because we know we have our noise suppressor, we have a relay, and we have a fuse in the path on the way to the battery. Now let's take a look at the negative side. So we have 12.04 volts. These are obviously the 12 volts that we need to run the defroster grid, yet we dropped them on the negative side. If we look at the wiring diagram, it's a short run from the defroster grid to the ground point. So we can do a voltage drop test from the grid to the ground point, or from the ground point back up to the negative terminal of the battery. In either case, we're going to find the location of our voltage drop, although as I suspect, the ground point may be the issue. So let's take a look. So as I suspected, we found our problem at the ground point. The voltage drop testing that we did on this circuit is the exact same voltage drop testing we did on the breadboard earlier. We can't see the full loop like we could on the breadboard, but we know that everything starts and ends at that car battery. That's our voltage source. And our load was a defroster grid back here. Once again, it didn't matter that there was a fuse, a relay, and a noise suppressor in that path. This is the load, and this is what's going to get the majority of the voltage drop. This voltage drop series is going to be multi-part, and we're going to do voltage drop on other vehicles as we move forward. So there will be a post-test. It's recommended that you download the technician reference booklet, Electric Theory and Diagnosis Part A. Use Control F to help you find the answers to your questions. Thank you for watching.